All right, welcome to this episode of the Exertis Broadcast Podcast. I'm your host, Mr. Nicholas Smith, coming to you, as always, from the sunny hills of Folsom, California. Not in the jail, but near it. That is a very good distinction. In studio today, running the audio side, is Mr. Jordan Friday. Jordan, thank you. Good. See, he's got to yell to get on. We didn't recognize his way. And over on the video switch is Delana Collins. Thank you, Delana. We know you have choices in the morning. We're glad you made the choice to come to work. That's good. Okay, but as a special guest in studio, I've got all the way from where? Chicago, Stephen Forrest from Vitec. Stephen, thanks for being here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right, good. Okay, so let's just start off. What do you do at Vitec?
I'm the sales director for our enterprise sales team.
Okay, and now you haven't always been at Vitec. Vitec, previously it was Exterity.
Correct. So last year in April, Vitec purchased Exterity, and really kind of two massive leading Iptv digital signage companies came together. Very much a kind of marriage, and really kind of made the powerhouse for going forward for the future for all of this kind of IPTV and digital signage technology.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to look at this from the outside because, I mean, we're very familiar with Exterity. We've got a long, sort of history together on that side, and to see like you've got sort of the commercial industry with Exterity and then sort of the sports and professional industry with Vitec, deciding to see that come together. Now you've got just this monster that can solve a lot of different problems.
Absolutely,
right?
Yeah. Vitec, huge in broadcast, and military, and federal, and stadiums and casinos. And then the Exterity side was very big in corporate, finance, healthcare, hospitality, and all those other kind of markets as well. So it was very much two sets of technology that could really tackle different vertical markets really, really well. Yeah,
no doubt. So today, kind of, from a conversational standpoint, I think you and I were talking sort of previous to the show, we kind of want to demystify a couple things about IPTV, right? And also kind of square away where that sort of coincides or sometimes supersedes AV over IP, right? And so let's kind of dive into that a little bit and talk, and for those in the audience, we're not going to get nitty gritty on the speeds and feeds here. It's more about the application side, right?
Absolutely.
So, Delana, pop us up on slide number 1 here, and kind of, one of the things I think we want to talk about is like, what is AV over IP? Right. And then compare that to IPTV, because while they both have P's in the, in the word, they're very different things. Right. But they're all both utilizing the network effectively. Right. To transport. So from an AV over IP standpoint, we sort of see this more being the sort of glue that brings together a conference room or a single space, getting your laptop from sort of, the console, the table up to the screen in the front of the room, which is great. There's a lot of AV over IP technologies, based on different codecs, proprietary codecs, non-proprietary codecs, out of different flavors. How does that differentiate though from IPTV and what you all at Vitec are showing people?
Yeah, absolutely. So AV over IP is probably the closest replacement for a traditional kind of RF analog system. So it's very much designed to work on a dedicated network, so separate switches, separate cables. So when you're starting to design a building, you've got to start to factor in, okay, I need to have my IP network for my phones, my PCs, and all the other data and things that's going to happen. And then you may have to put in a separate network and sort of wire the building again just for video. And that's typically how an AV over IP system would work. And so you're kind of having to maintain dual networks, a little bit less efficient, and it's largely due to the bandwidth. So AV over IP is usually uncompressed or compressed very little. And so the bandwidth requirements to push that video around is actually huge. So it's great for when you're in a conference room and you're connecting your laptop and you want it on the screens around you. That's a perfect application for AV over IP. Where it starts to get a lot more complicated and you start looking at a lot more spends for large, 10, 20, 50 gig backbone networks, is when you're trying to get that video from a data center in the basement to 15 floors of your building. Now, AV over IP starts to get very complex at that point. And that's where IPTV can really come in, and you can leverage those existing IP networks to get your video from A to B to C and so on.
Yeah, let's go. Take me to slide 2 on this one. And I promise, audience, we're not going to slide you to death. I mean, you can see we're not about the PowerPoint here. But that's that change. So in the IPTV world, we can sort of have data existing and phone and all this other information existing alongside
Exactly.
content.
Yeah.
Right.
So in IPTV, video is just data. Same as everything else that's on the IP network. Whereas in AV over IP, video is largely still video. And so it's dedicated for that one application. So you just don't get the efficiency.
Now you mentioned, and here's where I guess we can get a little nerdy. You mentioned like bandwidth, right? And the amount of bandwidth. And we're seeing some AV over IP systems push into the 10 gig network range, right? To get that truly uncompressed. Is there any loss to the users by going to what I would assume would be a more compressed system with IPTV?
Yeah.
Is there any visual loss? Is there any quality loss to sort of the viewers from that perspective?
No, largely the video quality is going to be the same. No one's going to be able to tell the difference of an AV over IP versus an IPTV when it's connected to a 4K display or an HD display around your office, if you're watching on your PC or something like that. Latency, typically AV over IP has very low latency. There are different IPTV manufacturers out there. I know from a Vitec perspective, our latency is also very low, so it can still be used in a lot of applications where people might have been hesitant in the past. We have very low latency, so we can also deal with getting sort of live news, breaking news to traders on a trading floor. So that kind of application can all still be done very effectively with our IPTV system.
That's interesting. So Del, take us to this next slide here. And I guess this is, as you kind of mentioned there, opportunity. This is kind of where we start to square the two systems together, right? And start to say, well, why one over the other? So ideally, you mentioned like, okay, in a conference room, it probably makes a lot of sense to use AV over IP in that space. But as we start to go to multiple locations, multiple destinations, suddenly then now maybe IPTV makes more sense. And this is where IPTV comes in, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I mean, I've always kind of viewed this as just from a macro level, right? We sort of look at Comcast and Wave and all of our cable operators. They are IPTV, right? They're delivering content over an IP-based network. However, their network is really big and is covering homes rather than offices. And so for me, IPTV is sort of the concept or the ability to build that same environment within my own network, right? I now control content across my entire building, which might be television content coming from, like you said, the basement, right? Or it might be, on-demand content. So that concept of being able to build your own localized Comcast distribution, but within your building under your complete control, is effectively what IPTV can bring, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can bring in the content. It's still going to come from your cable company, from your satellite company. We're going to bring that in, and then we're going to allow you to manage how it's distributed around your building. So we'll still encrypt it to protect the content. That's going to keep your cable company or satellite company happy. Obviously, copyright content protection is a big thing these days, and that's something that IPTV, at least from Vitec, can handle very well. But yeah, it allows you to do that kind of control of who's getting what content and when throughout the building. So, with the traditional RF or, with a lot of AV over IP, the video just exists and everyone can see it. With IPTV, I could be logging in with my LDAP credentials in a corporate office, and that's dictating what I'm allowed to do. So, I'm working in the marketing team. I can see the news. I can see the business channels. But if I'm an executive, I might be able to get ESPN. But you can control who's getting what and when based on seniority, based on their job function, based on whatever criteria is important for that organization. And that's a really powerful tool that IPTV can bring. Yeah,
let me jump back. You mentioned something back there, RF. Mm-hmm. Is sort of IPTV the heir apparent of the RF replacement? I mean, if we're looking at old buildings, right? RF cables everywhere. We're pushing just television through that. But ideally, you could ditch your RF network now and go completely with IPTV.
Oh, correct. Absolutely. In terms of longevity, RF components, the chips and everything that go inside them, more and more difficult to get. Less manufacturing plants make these. And so if you're thinking long term, in the next 2, 3, 5, 7 years, if you're doing a new building, replacing parts that are failing if you've put in an RF network is going to become very, very difficult.
Well, let alone being able to scale up into whatever resolution comes next, right? I mean, people are talking about 8K. I'm not seeing a lot of 8K TVs yet, but at some point, you're not even going to be able to find a 1080p TV, because it'll all be 4K. And will those RF networks support moving into 4K and 6K and 8K and whatever comes
and
next.
this is not possible.
Yeah. Well, and the sort of the IP network is agnostic, right?
Exactly.
It
It's just data. I mean, we're talking, easily we could do, 4K at maybe 10 megabits per second, 12 megabits per second, HD, 5 or 6 megabits per second, and still give you that great quality.
Yeah.
And so that really allows you to have that almost infinite scale.
It's sort of the IT guy's dream come true, right? It's like, okay, I can have video on my network, but I can control it. I can manage the bandwidth, and it's not going to crush my network.
They can put it on a VLAN. Yeah. They can, quality of service. They can do all the IT things that they like. Yeah. And then AV facilities can focus on what is the experience in the room for watching video. And they don't have to worry about how it gets there. That's just another data packet on the network.
But so there's one other point that you mentioned in there, which is the ability to touch it from a computer, right? To pop up an interface, get your content, view content. And with most AV over IP systems, they're proprietary, right? There's very few of them that have the ability to be viewed on a web page without going through some level of other service. Most of them require a box, a decoder.
Exactly. It's an encode decode.
Yeah. You have decoders, right? But you also have the ability for the IPTV content to be seen on a web page, right? And what's the value of that, though, for, say, a standard customer?
Yeah, it comes down to flexibility. A lot of customers, they want TVs around their offices, around their stadium, all those applications. That's great. With IPTV or AV over IP, you can do that. You're putting a box behind the TV, HDMI into the screen. With IPTV, though, you've got a whole suite of other options. So it could be, I want to stream to my desktop, PC, Mac, whatever. I want to watch it on my tablet, my mobile device. As younger generations are coming into the workplace, there's a much bigger demand for that kind of decentralized. I want to watch this on my tablet while I'm walking on the Wi-Fi network to my meeting. There's all that kind of capability.
You've seen my kids in my house. That's
yeah. And so IPTV lets you do that. And there's also bringing in complications like what a large corporate networks, they might have a thin client. You're not going to get AV over IP to work with a thin client, but certain IPTV manufacturers, including us, we can handle that. Yeah. And so that really kind of opens up where video can go to a much larger audience. Also things like being able to work with system on chip. So we're seeing a big move, especially in certain verticals, healthcare, hospitality, places like that, accommodation, where system on chip, smart TVs basically is a much bigger draw than having a decode set-top box. Partly for security, they don't want people to play around with cables, or they don't want people to unplug things or try to steal stuff. But also kind of for simplicity as well. So if you walk into a hospital or hotel room, we're going to go directly into the smart TV. Could be LG, Samsung, Sony, Philips. We're directly into that smart TV. There's no hardware in the room, whether it's the patient bedside, the guest room, or whatever, and that can be really useful.
One other kind of brewing conversation, and that's we went through this that it shall not be named event in our lives the last couple of years, and now as people are coming back to the office, one of the things I'm hearing more and more is, okay, well, maybe we don't want a giant conference room that we shove 500 people in to share a message and then have the after effect of, well, did we just do a super spreader event in our own organization? And there's an interesting conversation here with IPTV in the terms of being able to say, hey, go ahead and stay at your desk and watch this on your computer. Right. So you're in the building, you get to see the event, get that information that's, available, but maybe not put yourself at risk of getting COVID again or for the first time for some of us. Right. So I think that's an interesting piece of the puzzle here that, this is allowing sort of being able to take meetings and events and messages throughout an organization, but be able to safely distribute that content.
Yeah, absolutely. You have a big auditorium. It can, normally sit 500 people, but you're going to limit it to 200. Those other 300 people, what do? They watch it on their PC at their desk. Yeah. They might go into a conference room and watch it there. There's a lot of options of how they want to consume that. They might even be consuming it from home, and we're doing some kind of VPN or cloud-based, delivery, just to allow them to access that content. So.
Yeah, and then so then let's take this one level further, which is the ability to now create content or record content and do content on demand, right? And I think that's a layer of AV over IP that doesn't really exist because it's about transport, not about consumption, right?
Correct.
And IPTV is about consumption. Your local Comcast gives you on-demand content. Where do you guys sit with that?
The same. So we can have video on demand, recording. There's various different ways to do it depending on what the customer's trying to achieve, basically.
Yeah.
But yeah, it could be centrally recorded. It'd be recorded on your PC. There's different ways of doing it that way. You can record it via the interface on the endpoints, the set-top boxes, kind of like you would do at home. So there's lots of options there for being able to record content, and depends on what the use case is. If it's someone in the marketing department, they might want to record it centrally on a server because it's going to be available to multiple users. The CEO is doing an interview on Bloomberg, and they want to capture that so people can watch it back, later. So recording that centrally, great application. But if I just want to monitor something that's important for just my job that doesn't matter for everyone else, I might want to just record that locally, onto my desktop and play it back myself. So you get that whole flexibility of when you're consuming content, how you need to consume content. Different organizations have different priorities, and different verticals have different needs for it. So in something like hospitality, it could be patient education, right, or patient entertainment, depending on what the video on demand is all about. But it's part of the IPTV system, video on demand and recording.
I assume security's got to be a big piece of this as well, because not all content. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily want to take very sensitive internal messaging in meetings and put them on the web where they could be shared or, accidentally lose a password, versus if it's in my IPTV system, like you said earlier, you've got LDAP, you've got layers of control that ensure your content stays where you want your content.
Exactly. Yeah. If you're putting video on demand into the cloud, that can be very useful. Lots of companies are doing it, but you do have the security aspect of it. If you have some kind of data breach, single factor authentication in play or something like that, then yeah, your sensitive material could be shared everywhere. Whereas if you're storing that locally inside your building, inside your IP network, then there's multiple layers of security that are protecting that, even above the IPTV system itself, and that's going to make sure that data stays safe.
So we kind of mulled through on-demand and event-based content TV. Let's talk about digital signage.
Sure.
I mean, digital signage is sort of core to everything that people are doing these days. Where does digital signage fall into IPTV, especially since traditionally it's done on separate boxes, their own little set-top boxes, could be third party. Where does it fit in the IPTV world?
With the Vitec platforms, we do IPTV and digital signage. So it allows us to kind of leverage what the customer wants to do that day. Do they want it to be an IPTV endpoint, watching live TV, watching video on demand, using a remote control to navigate channels? Or is it a digital signage endpoint with Twitter, with scrolling text, with whatever kind of internal comms that the marketing and communications team want to push out that day? So because we can do both and the endpoints can do both, you can flip between that based on what's happening in the building that day. So a lot of flexibility versus having a dedicated IPTV only system or a dedicated signage only system where you can only do one or the other. So you're really kind of starting to leverage what's happening on the network to its maximum, being able to use the hardware endpoints that are in place throughout your building based on anything that needs to come today, but also tomorrow.
And so what about somebody who has an existing signage platform that they're using? Can that be embedded into the IPTV system?
Usually a lot of the modern platforms, we have two ways of working with them, or three, I guess, technically. One, some of them will have a local video in, so we could take the output from one of our media players and feed it in, so if they wanted to have those live channels. Typically, what we're seeing more and more is that most signage platforms can take our video directly from the network and embed it. So if you have already made a decision on a certain path with your digital signage, we can still usually hand off the video to it. As long as it's unencrypted, because most standalone signage systems will not support encryption like we could. And that's a pretty common way of doing it. And then sometimes even we've done something as simple as we've taken one signage endpoint, encoded it, and turned it into a signage channel, and then just pushed that out throughout the IPTV system as sort of channel one, as sort of the information.
That's pretty traditional in hospitality, right? You go in your hotel room, channel one is here's what's happening in the hotel today.
Exactly.
It's the same concept.
That would allow you to achieve that really easily. And it's a nice sort of stepping stone as well. So if a big company's made a lot of investment in signage and now they're looking at us for IPTV, we can keep working with their signage that they've got, but in the long term, they might want to start looking at, swapping things out as things are failing or things are end of lifing or coming out of warranty. It might be a good time that they could just turn on signage within our system, and all of a sudden the endpoints that they put in place behind the TVs will just work.
Yeah. So there's an interesting conversation too, as you get to multiple location. Right. And AV over IP, again, we started, it's like it's a network problem. It's a local network problem. But if I've got two buildings and they're, in separate locations, how does IPTV then sort of traverse these two locations.
Yeah, I mean that's a great example of where we can scale like an AV over IP system can. So if you're a corporate customer or a higher education customer, you've got multiple campuses, multiple buildings around a city, around the state, around the world. It doesn't really matter. Big as your network is as big as we can go, really. You can have a management server in place in your headquarters, and all of your signage, all of your IPTV users are accessing that from your remote offices across your WAN network. They might be pulling in video that's local to that location. So you might be bringing in, your Comcast feed in one office, you're bringing in a Spectrum feed in another. The video they're watching is local to them, but the actual management and control happens at a higher level from the head office, and it's delivering out the sort of the instructions, the interface, the channel lineup, and everything to the users.
Interesting. So are there any other missing pieces of the puzzle here that sort of elevate IPTV that people should know or people should see?
Definitely control. So, the ability to dictate what's happening when. I'll use prisons as a good example. It's probably a vertical that people haven't thought of. But
we think about it often since we're so
it's
close
here in
to
Tulsa,
it.
maybe. My understanding is it's federally mandated that prisoners have to get news. And so one of the ways that's done is via TV. And so with IPTV, you can actually use it as a behavioral reward mechanism. So if the inmates are behaving, they can get access to sports, entertainment, as well as news. But if there's a problem, from a flick of a switch or a quick drag and drop in the interface, all of a sudden it's just basic news, and that's all people will get on their TVs. So instead of having to physically wheel in and out TVs or any kind of sort of system like that, which you'd have to do with RF, with IPTV, it's a quick press a button on your phone, and all of a sudden all kinds of changes can happen throughout the system, restricting channel content, and things like that. Also ties in really nicely to like emergency messaging. It's a big thing of what we do. The fact that we can do digital signage and IPTV means that in the event of active shooter, fire, severe weather, or any kind of sort of fire life safety event,
ran out of cookies in the break room. Yeah.
Exactly, priority things.
Oh, absolutely.
We can change everything on the system, within seconds.
Yeah.
And so that really kind of adds another level of capability and a kind of automation throughout the management server that can really kind of drive a lot of value across pretty much all verticals these days. Need that kind of, it's something along those lines, depending on what it is, whether it's a stadium, corporate customer, education, and pretty much everywhere. They need to have that ability to send out mass notifications to pretty much every screen, in the building.
So as kind of bringing this back around, the original conversation is why IPTV over AVIP? Because so many people, it's like suddenly the network was new to a lot of people, and it was like, I can use that for video. So AV over IP is like kind of like every manufacturer is putting out an AV over IP product. And before anybody in the audience sends me the nasty letter saying I've got AV over IP all wrong, it's the coolest thing since sliced bread. I agree, it's cool. Where do you see them coexisting in the same? Do you see the ability for AV over IP and IPTV to coexist in the same environments?
Yeah, absolutely. So corporate is a good example. I'm in a conference room. I'm using AV over IP to display things locally within the screens. But I might be in a conference room and there's breaking news, and I want to change over to the IPTV system, which is maybe a touch panel on the wall. I press a button. The user doesn't know we've changed from the local AV over IP, bring in my laptop feed, kind of extension to one of our media players connected on HDMI 2. And all of a sudden, I'm accessing the IPTV system where I'm pulling up all the live channels and navigating to whatever sort of broadcast news or something I wanted to, or internal corporate event, the CEO town hall, the latest training from HR, whatever the content may be. And so you've got that kind of duality where there's definitely applications where both exist.
Yeah, and it can be, again, going back to an earlier statement, it can be two different networks, right? And again, it's seamless to the user. They don't know they switch from network 1 local to network 2, which is, campus wide.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
That's very impressive. All right, awesome. Well, look, so where do people go to find out more? Where do people learn? How do they grow with the Vitec line?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the easiest thing to do is to jump on the website, www.vitec.com, and all information is there, contact information is there as well, or you can reach out to your Exertis Broadcast rep as well.
Perfect. All right, Stephen, thanks for being on the show. And I think you're due to be on in another podcast here soon. So
Sometime
I'll
soon.
see you on the next episode. All right, that's been today's episode of the Exertis Broadcast Podcast. Thanks to my guest, Stephen. Thanks for Delana and Jordan running the show today. And we'll see you all on the next episode.